Regulation of war and the behaviour of states. Really? But is it not like issuing speeding tickets at the Indianapolis 500? A triumph of naivety and legalism over the reality of the world. The quote is from Apocalypse Now, by the way. But do we really need a globalised regulation of wartime behaviour? Join me, Darasz, for How We Got Here.
In November, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and Hamas commander Mohammed Deif over alleged war crimes. But in the case of the Israelis, the Palestinians braving shelling, hunger and death in Gaza doubt that word would become flesh.
The decision will not be implemented because America protects Israel and it can veto anything. These leaders are above the law on an international level because Israel is a rogue state and laws can't be implemented on it. The decision of the criminal court and others are implemented on weak nations.
And while some said they would comply with the warrant,
of course, if there were to be such a visit to the UK, there would be a court process and due process would be followed in relation to those issues.
Others doubted the efficiency of the decision.
There are many legal doubts, and then the feasibility seems to be a very theoretical one, because Netanyahu will never go to a country where he could be arrested. Then how does he come and is he arrested by whom?
But Russian leader Vladimir Putin's September visit to Mongolia, a signatory of the Rome Treaty, proves that those under an ICC arrest warrant don't have to be that concerned when traveling around. Mongolia's refusal to arrest Putin earned the country a rebuke from the ICC, but nothing more. This is because international law and institutions dictating it enjoy only as much compliance as individual countries deign appropriate to show. But with no overarching enforcement, the ICC decisions can and are easily disregarded. As for Netanyahu, France, Germany and Hungary are some examples of European countries who said they would not obey the court's decision. The United States, not being a member of the ICC, would not arrest the Israeli PM or his defense chief. Some American policymakers went as far as to invoke the so-called Hague Invasion Act, which authorizes the use of military force to liberate any American or citizen of a US allied country being held by the court, which is located in The Hague. Now, threatened with economic sanctions from the US and other forms of pressure from Russia, the ICC, which wants Netanyahu for the alleged use of starvation as a weapon in Israel's war, is itself suffering a famine of obedience.
I'm delighted once more to welcome Joanna Siekiera, Assistant Professor at the War Studies University here in Warsaw. Welcome once more to the programme.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be back.
Let's go straight into the idea of the realities of the ICC against Benjamin Netanyahu, his defence minister, and the Mohammed Deif, the Hamas. So the Hamas leader. How did you react to that? How do you evaluate that? Is that a feasible thing to do, given the current climate, or is it just interfering in two parties trying to fight this brutal and existential war?
I would even go further and say that was another failure of international legal system, because Israel is not part of the International Criminal Court. So what ICC did, it's just a repetition of the arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin, where Russia is also not part of ICC. So what kind of signal are we sending to other countries? Is international legal system reliable or not? Since there is no legal basis to persecute not only citizens of countries which are not members, but also their heads of state, which possess this immunity as head of states. And as for terrorist group Hamas, it's also hard because they belong to which country, since Palestine is not a country,
right.
a state, independent state. So again, I am very sad to observe that we, as the Western world, we are not using international law as we should. This is, for me, unacceptable, because we are sending wrong signals to those who are breaching international law.
Is this an exercise in virtue signalling by the ICC, or is it just an empty gesture? Given sovereign immunity, Hamas doesn't represent a state. How does this make the ICC look, given this action?
Again, I will repeat, it makes ICC look weak. This is what researching on lawfare, legal warfare, for me it's hard to understand that we have legal tools, because we do have them, but there is the lack of political will to move forward. And also about Israel, we must remember that Israel is our ally. This is ally of NATO. We live in the same culture, Judeo-Christian culture. Yes. So this is very tricky. Is it the right moment? Also minding Netanyahu's internal problems. I don't think this is the right thing to do. There is, when it comes to Russia and Iran wars from last year, that there is not only legal base, but also institution. There is no ad hoc tribunal. And I don't think states would like to establish such tribunal, because we could have. So unfortunately, but we can observe that institutions of international courts, but also International Criminal Court as the agency of United Nations, they are not fulfilling their mission. Unfortunately, there are less and less people believing in UN.
We'll come on to the will and the credibility of the system later on in our discussion. Can I take you on a kind of a historical horizon tour? Is the idea of this regulation of behaviour in wartime, state behaviour in wartime, is that a Western thing? How did that come about? Is it Thomas Aquinas and Christianity, all that sort of stuff?
Everything, and also Grotius. Yes, the international law system has been built in decades, ages, throughout the centuries and countries. But contrary to national law, it has a lot of loopholes, gaps. Some say even it is very weak. My friends, lawyers, they even accuse me that there is nothing such thing as international law. And of course there is, but the problem is this is all based on voluntary basis. If states want to join some treaties, some tribunals, yes. With Nuremberg, that was the beginning of this history of international war tribunals. But then we had so much different political environment, where not only Nazi Germany, but also Japanese Empire, they admit, yes, we are defeated, and now we give ourselves to the international institutions. Now nobody even expects that Russian Federation would do the same. So international politics looks now so much different. And also countries, they are not stupid. War criminals, they know how to breach the law. They know how to maneuver between those weaknesses and loopholes.
I've got a problem with this, as I mentioned to you before, that this idea, as your students have, with this idea of the international law, the international rules-based order. You mentioned Nuremberg there. Doesn't that show up the total weakness of such a way of thinking? For example, try the Germans for their activities, and yet on the winning side was the Soviet Union. Doesn't that show up the fundamental paradox of calling someone a criminal, when in fact you could be one yourself on those rules.
So even this morning, I had classes with our soldiers, Polish soldiers, about targeting, and they were using exact the same arguments that you just did. So I always say two things. First of all, the fact that law is not obeyed doesn't mean it does not exist. Like with road code, when we drive a car, when you see red light and you don't stop the car, it doesn't mean that the law stopped existing. This is just you who broke the law. So the fact that war criminals are there, it doesn't mean that international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict stopped to exist. And second, for example, in 2016, we had a famous judgment by the Permanent Arbitrary Tribunal, China versus Philippines, stating then that the territory, maritime territory, does not belong to China, as China claims, but to the Philippines. But the problem is not with the law, but the execution of the law. Who would do that? We've seen all those videos, how Coast Guard is fighting.
Collision with the...
Indeed, with fishermen. This is unacceptable. Yet there is no one like International Maritime Coast Guard. There are no funds, there are no institutions to execute following this judgment against China. And China said, no, we don't like the judgment. We will keep doing what we've been always doing.
Yes, I mean, that's on a national sovereign level, but it filters down to the actions of individual soldiers on the battlefield. What influence do you think this has, or the idea that you could be prosecuted if you pull your trigger on an enemy soldier and get hauled up before the court on it? What effect does that have on a soldier's thinking at the low level? You know, you're in a trench, you have to make a split-second decision.
Indeed, indeed. I heard also today from my soldiers their testimonies that when they are sent to the border with Belarus, on one hand they know the mission, they have Polish flag on arm, but they are not sure if the law will back them up. And this is the, I would say, largest weakness, which might only increase when maybe there will be large-scale war, because I've said that many times, that with Polish soldiers on the mission, there goes a prosecutor whose job is to find evidence to say that the soldier's actions were illegal, so he would be guilty. But with Americans, there will be always attorney to back them up, to say, I know that you did everything in your capacity to fulfill the mission. You didn't want to kill a civilian or didn't want to go far beyond your competences.
There was a Polish example, wasn't there, from the Iraq War about the mortar bombardment of a village. So you have to, the onus on you in the Polish sphere is to find a criminal, not to defend it. So they send someone out to find a mistake or find a crime rather than to defend the soldiers against that.
Well, if only that was simple.
Strange way to run a war.
Yes, it is, and it will be even more complicated because law and international law institutions, they come as very weak. So totalitarian regimes, terrorist groups, they will hit even harder in our legal systems, seeing that there are no tools or political will to prosecute them. And this is what I claim, that we should really start using law as a weapon, not only to protect us as a shield, but also as a sword. Because if we will not protect our values as democracy, transparency of our institutions, equality, then nobody else will do that.
We can't see that happening in the case of President Putin or Mr. Netanyahu, unfortunately. But it's a question of will, as you said. What are the historic successes of this system of bringing so-called war criminal to justice?
Then I will reverse your question and say what kind of failures we have, because so far
War failures.
zero heads of states were prosecuted before international criminal courts. Zero. We had closest Slobodan Milosevic, but he died in arrest for a heart attack. And some claim that in Sierra Leone we had this verdict, but then again that was semi-international, more based on national system persecution. So again, when we look at the international system, I would say it's not encouraging. Yes, we had some, I would say, minors, attempts or judgments, but then again they are not promoting peace and security. They are not strong enough for war criminals to stop or to rethink their actions, because they are not stupid. They see, they scroll down what kind of judgments, and actually the price is worth it. Unfortunately, the price is worth to kill, to bombard, to terror.
Yes. A final question to you, Professor Siekiera. What's the can you see a day when the system collapses because it's riddled with paradoxes and contradictions?
Yes, I personally hope that we will change United Nations system. First of all, Big Five, because it's a very colonial system, and we have two totalitarian regimes, China and Russia, blocking absolutely everything. So we must change that system, because that system is not prepared for 21st century's conflicts. And then we have cyber, we have AI, we have psychological warfare, and those are not regulated by international humanitarian law. So if we have those loopholes, then war criminals will target us through them.
I suppose a cynic like me would doubt all this international law and humanitarian stuff, but ultimately, without it, it's even worse.
Indeed, this is what I always say to my students. Indeed.
Yes, if you didn't have it. Joanna, Siekiera, thank you very much for coming onto the programme.
Thank
Great to have
you.
you. So that's it. That's all we have time for. Do join us next time for How We Got Here.